Welcome to the most talked about conflict of the 21st century, the US-China trade war. What began as a simple political move has spiraled into a full-fledged economic battle that has sent shockwaves around the globe. In 2025, more than 7 years after the first shots were fired in the form of tariffs, we are still stuck in a never-ending game of economic chess between the United States and China. But here's the real question: are we really witnessing a trade war, or has this just become the worst reality show in global economics? When Donald Trump first assumed office in 2017, he promised to put America first. His plan? To reduce the trade deficit with China and bring manufacturing jobs back to the US. The way he was going to do this? By slapping tariffs on Chinese goods, hoping that the higher costs would force China to play fair in trade. Fast forward to today, and the tariffs are still there, but have they worked? Are American companies truly thriving, or are we just paying more for everything? The problem is this: it's hard to argue that this is a win-win situation. For the most part, the ones who end up paying the price aren't just Chinese manufacturers, they're American consumers. Let's face it, tariffs are like putting a band-aid on a broken leg. They may make it seem like you're fixing something, but in reality, you're just shifting the problem elsewhere. And in this case, that elsewhere is your wallet. But China hasn't been sitting idly by. While President Xi JinPing may not have had his own version of America First, he had his own plan, a much quieter, but no less impactful, strategy of economic dominance. Over the past decade, China has built its Belt and Road Initiative, cemented its hold on rare earth metals, and expanded its global influence. So, what's happening now? Are we witnessing a real trade war, or has it just become a long, drawn-out economic chess match with no clear winner in sight? This video will break it all down. We'll explore the tariffs, the trade deals, the retaliations, and the impact on both countries. We'll also try to answer the ultimate question: is Trump losing the trade war with China, or has he actually outmaneuvered Xi Jinping? Spoiler alert, it's complicated. So sit back, relax, and get ready for an inside look into the mess that is the US-China trade war. It's going to be a bumpy ride. Let's take a trip back to the beginning, January 2017. Donald Trump takes office and delivers his inaugural speech, promising to put America first. He didn't just mean in terms of foreign policy, he meant in trade, too. From the moment he stepped into the Oval Office, Trump made it clear that he wanted to change the way America interacted with the rest of the world, particularly China. The trade deficit with China was a major target for Trump. In 2017, the US had a trade deficit with China of more than $375 billion. Trump claimed that this was an example of China taking advantage of America's trade policies and that it was time to level the playing field. His solution? Tariffs. Specifically, tariffs on Chinese goods worth billions of dollars. This move was meant to make Chinese products more expensive, thereby reducing their competitiveness in the US market and forcing China to negotiate better terms. But as we all know, things don't always go according to plan. By 2018, the tariffs were in full swing. In the first year alone, Trump imposed tariffs on roughly $250 billion worth of Chinese goods. The tariffs were intended to push China into making concessions on issues like intellectual property theft and forced technology transfers. But did they? Not exactly. While China did agree to some trade deals, they didn't completely change their ways. Instead, China retaliated by imposing their own tariffs on US goods, including soybeans, pork, and automobiles. But let's talk about the impact of all this. Initially, Trump supporters cheered. After all, he was doing what he promised, standing up to China. But as the tariffs grew, so did the consequences. American farmers found themselves in the middle of a trade war that they didn't ask for. Soybean prices plummeted, and agricultural exports to China dropped dramatically. The farmers who were supposed to benefit from Trump's trade policies were now some of the biggest casualties of the trade war. Meanwhile, American consumers started feeling the pinch too. Everything from clothing to electronics to household goods became more expensive, thanks to the tariffs. It wasn't just about the big-ticket items either. The cost of living began to rise as the trade war dragged on. This was a far cry from what Trump promised in 2017 when he said that China would pay for the tariffs. Instead, American businesses and consumers were the ones footing the bill. But Trump wasn't done yet. He continued to push forward with his America First agenda, even as the effects of the tariffs became more apparent. It was clear that his policies were doing more harm than good, at least from an economic standpoint. But was he willing to back down? Not in the slightest. In fact, Trump doubled down on his approach, imposing even more tariffs and escalating the conflict with China. And why? Because he believed that a show of strength would force China to change its ways. But as the trade war dragged on, it became clear that both sides were locked in a stalemate. And unfortunately, it was the American people who were stuck in the middle of it all. By 2025, the trade war had become more of a marathon than a sprint. The tariffs were still in place, and the economic damage was already done. And while Trump may still be claiming victory, the truth is that the American people are the ones who've lost the most in this trade war. While President Trump was busy tweeting about China and imposing tariffs, President Xi Jinping was quietly playing the long game. China's strategy didn't rely on short-term victories or flashy moves. Instead, it was all about steady progress, economic influence, and strategic positioning. One of the biggest weapons in China's arsenal is its control over rare earth minerals. These minerals are crucial for the production of everything from smartphones to electric vehicles, and China controls more than 70% of the world's supply. In a world increasingly reliant on technology, that's an incredibly powerful bargaining chip. So while Trump was busy imposing tariffs on Chinese goods, Xi was building economic relationships elsewhere, positioning China as a global leader. China's Belt and Road Initiative, launched in 2013, was one of the cornerstones of Xi's strategy. This massive infrastructure project aimed to connect China to countries across Asia, Europe, and Africa through trade routes and investments. It was a way for China to extend its influence globally and secure access to crucial markets and resources. Meanwhile, Trump's America First policy was, ironically, making America more isolated. As China grew its global influence, the U.S. was left looking inward, consumed by its own trade war. But let's not forget about China's retaliation in the trade war. While Trump was busy imposing tariffs, China hit back with their own, sometimes with even higher rates. The U.S. responded with more tariffs, and China responded in kind. But there was something else happening behind the scenes. China was working on strengthening its own economy, reducing its dependence on the U.S., and expanding its trade relationships with countries in Europe, Africa, and beyond. So, what's the result of all this? While the US and China may have been locked in a fierce trade battle, the reality is that China was slowly shifting the global economic balance in its favor. It was never just about the trade war, it was about positioning China for long-term dominance in the global economy. As the trade war continues into 2025, it's clear that China has not only survived the tariffs but has found ways to thrive despite them. While the US may have made short-term gains, China's long-term strategy is paying off. And as Trump continues to push forward with his policies, Xi is quietly securing China's place at the top of the global economic ladder. While the trade war between the US and China has been the subject of much debate, one thing is clear: it has had significant unintended consequences. No one could have predicted the far-reaching impact this conflict would have on consumers, businesses, and entire industries. At the core of the trade war are tariffs. When President Trump first imposed tariffs on Chinese goods, the idea was simple: raise the cost of Chinese imports, forcing American consumers to buy more domestically produced goods. The problem is that tariffs don't just affect the target country, they have a ripple effect that touches everyone. One of the most immediate consequences was the rise in prices. Tariffs make foreign goods more expensive, and that cost is passed on to the consumer. But it wasn't just Chinese goods that became more expensive. American manufacturers who rely on Chinese parts also saw costs increase. From tech gadgets to clothing to cars, the prices of everyday goods started to climb. The result? A higher cost of living for everyone. And then there was the impact on American businesses. Companies that relied on cheap Chinese imports were forced to either absorb the higher costs or pass them along to their customers. Many chose to move their operations out of China, setting up shop in countries like Vietnam, Mexico, or India. While this may have alleviated some of the pain, it also meant that American companies had to adjust to a new set of challenges, navigating unfamiliar supply chains, dealing with new tariffs, and rethinking their strategies. And don't forget about the agricultural sector. One of the hardest-hit industries in the U.S. was farming. China, a major importer of U.S. agricultural products, retaliated with tariffs of its own, slapping duties on soybeans, pork, and other staples. American farmers who had relied on China for exports found themselves stuck with crops they couldn't sell, leading to financial hardship for many. The trade war also had a lasting impact on global supply chains. Businesses that relied on cheap Chinese manufacturing were forced to look elsewhere, disrupting the global flow of goods. But these changes weren't just about tariffs, they were about the shifting balance of global economic power. By 2025, the damage had already been done. The US and China were both worse off, and the global economy had been thrown into uncertainty. The question is, was it worth it? Were the tariffs worth the pain and disruption they caused? The answer isn't clear, and in many ways, it's too soon to tell. As the trade war raged on, negotiations between the US and China became a key point of focus. The idea was simple: if both sides could sit down and hammer out a deal, maybe, just maybe, they could end this war and come to an agreement that would benefit both countries. But as we all know, things don't always go as planned. Trump, ever the negotiator, was adamant that the US would only accept a deal that benefited American workers and businesses. China, on the other hand, wasn't exactly rolling over. In fact, they were quite firm on their positions. At times, it seemed like the negotiations were more about playing one-upmanship than actually reaching a deal. The talks went back and forth like a never-ending ping-pong match. One day, Trump would announce that a deal was imminent; the next day, China would say, "Not so fast." It was frustrating, to say the least. And while both sides claimed to have made progress, the reality is that very little changed. The tariffs remained in place, and neither side was willing to back down. In the end, the trade talks turned into a game of waiting. Both sides seemed content to let the tariffs continue while they tried to work out a deal behind closed doors. But at the same time, they were also trying to outmaneuver each other on the global stage. It wasn't just about the trade war, it was about positioning each country as the dominant global power. By 2025, the negotiations had become a never-ending cycle of promises and disappointments. Both sides were still stuck in a stalemate, with no clear resolution in sight. The ping-pong match continued, but it was hard to tell who was winning. And honestly, it didn't matter because both sides were losing in the end. So, after all this time, who's actually winning the trade war between the US and China? The answer, unfortunately, is no one. Sure, both Trump and Xi Jinping claim victory, but the truth is that the real winners in this conflict are the businesses and governments that have managed to avoid the worst of the tariffs. While China may have been hurt by the tariffs, they've found ways to work around them. The same goes for American businesses; many have found alternative markets for their goods. But the real casualties of this trade war are the consumers. As prices rise and supply chains continue to falter, it's the everyday person who's left paying the price. In the end, the trade war has turned into a long, drawn-out battle that has accomplished very little. While both sides may claim victory, the real story is that the world economy has been disrupted, and no one is truly winning. So, as we head into 2025, it seems that the trade war is far from over. Alright. Let's take a moment to talk about Trump's leadership, or as I like to call it, the reality TV version of diplomacy. From day one, Trump approached the US-China trade war like it was an episode of The Apprentice, where the stakes were high, but the strategy was, let's just say, creative. Trump came into office promising to make America great again, and one of the first orders of business was tackling China, the world's second-largest economy. His approach? Slap tariffs on Chinese imports and get China to play by the rules. But here's the kicker: instead of a well-thought-out strategy, it often felt like Trump was winging it, like he was taking a shot in the dark and hoping something would stick. And for a while, it worked, sort of. The problem with Trump's trade war approach wasn't that he didn't have a plan, it's that he didn't seem to care whether it worked or not, as long as he could point at it and say, "I did that." It was less about winning the war and more about keeping the audience entertained. It was like watching a reality show where the main character keeps making up new rules as they go along, only this time, it's with billions of dollars and global markets at stake. Take Trump's trade talks, for example. One day he's saying, the trade war is over, and the next day, tariffs are back. It was like a constant emotional roller coaster, where no one, least of all China, knew where they stood. Trump's negotiating style was less world-class dealmaker, and more guy who threatens to fire you every 10 minutes. There was no consistency, no clear endgame, and most importantly, no clear understanding of what the long-term consequences would be. Let's not forget the dramatic flair. Trump treated the negotiations like a reality TV show, full of over-the-top promises and grand gestures. "We're going to win so much, you'll get tired of winning," he said. Fast forward to 2025, and no one is tired of losing, or at least, paying higher prices. Trump's promises didn't exactly match the results, but that didn't stop him from continuing to double down on his rhetoric. There's also the art of the deal mentality. You'd think a guy who wrote a book about negotiating would have a better handle on, well, negotiation. Instead, we saw an endless back and forth, with tariffs escalating like a bad breakup, where both sides refused to let go but keep piling on the drama. Trump's strategy seemed to be all about making the other side feel the pain, but as time went on, it became obvious that the only ones truly suffering were the American consumers. But here's where Trump's leadership really shines, or doesn't. While he was busy making bold claims and turning every trade negotiation into a spectacle, China just kept doing what it does best, quietly playing the long game. It was like watching Trump shout at the TV screen while Xi Jinping calmly picked up the pieces and made strategic moves behind the scenes. Trump's leadership wasn't about securing a future for the American economy, it was about creating headlines and soundbites for his supporters. Now, let's talk about the art of the tweet. We can't discuss Trump's leadership without mentioning his Twitter account. His tweets were like the soundtrack to the trade war. 1 minute, he's saying that China is great and they're about to sign a deal, and the next, he's calling them a currency manipulator again. It was like watching a high-stakes poker game, but one player kept revealing his hand to everyone. For all the talk about strategy, it was hard to take Trump's leadership seriously when his most powerful diplomatic tool was a 280-character rant. But let's not be too harsh, Trump's leadership did have its moments of brilliance. I mean, who else could get the world to care about tariffs on steel and soybeans? Who else could turn a simple trade dispute into a global phenomenon? Trump may not have had a solid strategy, but he sure knew how to keep people talking. In fact, the trade war became so iconic that we started seeing memes and TikToks about it. Maybe that's Trump's true legacy, he turned trade policy into a viral sensation. So, is Trump's leadership in the trade war a success or a failure? Well, it depends on who you ask. If you're judging by results, by actual trade reform, by improved American manufacturing, by stable prices, then, it's safe to say Trump's leadership didn't exactly deliver. But if you're judging by entertainment value, then give the man an Emmy. He's been a master at keeping us all glued to our screens. Ultimately, what we learned from Trump's approach to the trade war is this: leadership isn't just about making bold promises or turning negotiations into a spectacle. It's about having a clear strategy, understanding the consequences of your actions, and sticking to a plan. Unfortunately for Trump, his leadership style was more about shock value than real value, and while he kept the audience entertained, the economic fallout was felt far and wide. In the end, we might look back at this trade war as a giant reality show, one where the stakes were high, but the winner was anyone but the American consumer. So, if we're still here in 2025, watching tariffs rise and fall like a bad soap opera, we'll know exactly who to blame: the guy with the Twitter account who promised so much winning, and gave us so much pain instead. So, is Trump really losing the trade war with China? Or is this just part of a bigger picture? The truth is, the world's economy has been caught in the crossfire, and no one really wins in this situation. But we want to know your thoughts. Drop a comment below and tell us, who do you think is coming out on top in this never-ending war? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell for more updates on the trade war and what's really happening behind the scenes. Stay tuned for more.